Last month, Escape Motions released Rebelle version 7, but I held off doing an initial review because, to be perfectly honest, it might not have been particularly favourable. The software was a bit of a buggy mess when it first came out. So I've held off until now to give them a chance to release a couple more versions, get the software a little bit more stable, so that I could make a bit more of an informed review for you. Full disclosure, I do a little bit of work with Escape Motions occasionally. I've been a beta tester for them for the last few years. And that means that I look at the early version of the software, help them find bugs, review it, provide suggestions and potential enhancements. And as compensation for that, I get a free copy of the pro version of the software when it's released. So I'm incentivized to say good things. In this review, what I'm going to try and do is set that to the side and try and be a little bit more pragmatic, open and honest in terms of what I think about the software. So in this video, I'm going to have a look at some of the new features, what they do, how they work, or not, as the case may be, and try and provide you with an overall assessment of where Rebelle 7 is at the moment. My name's Pete. Welcome to Basement Picasso. So what we're going to do is have a little look at some of the key new features that have come through in version 7. We'll have a look at how they work, what's good about them, what some of the issues are, and then I'll give my personal perspective in a sort of cool wall style rating for each of the elements. And then at the end we can have a look at what the overall impression is. So we'll start with metallic paint first of all. You've probably seen the reviews and some of the videos that came out when they first launched it. To be able to use metallic, there are a number of features that work together. So the first thing is under oils and acrylics, there are a set of metallic brushes that you can use, and then there's a specific metallic colour palette that you're able to select, and if you want you can put the names of those on so you can see the material that is trying to emulate. And then if you start painting with that, what you'll find first of all is that actually that doesn't look metallic, because you then have to go over to the layer and on the layer enable metallic material. So the metallic is not a material property of the paint, it's a property of the layer. So you can then use the different brushes and you'll see that that starts to give you a very shiny, reflective picture. You can use the different brushes, get different effects. Some of them will blend together, other ones will make more specific sort of strokes. And you can use these colours and these brushes, but at the end of the day you can use any brush and any colour, and it will ultimately make that a metallic material. But these brushes and these colours have been designed to specifically mimic certain types of material. And then you can see that that works if you don't have nanopixel enabled, but obviously if you zoom in it's very pixelated. So if you pop on nanopixel, if you have the pro version, then you can zoom in and you can see that you've got very interesting but highly reflective textures within that paint. So that gives you the metallic materials and the way that you can work with that. Now, the problem with metallic materials is most likely you will want to mix metallic and non-metallic. And as we said, you can use any brush, but any brush that's got any kind of impasto working on this layer is simply going to be metallic. So if you want non-metallic paint, then you're going to have to create a new layer. Make sure you don't enable the metallic materials, and then you can paint with regular matte material and make your image that combines both of those together. Now, that may seem perfectly reasonable. For me, one of the things that I like to do with working with the thicker paints and with impasto type texture is to be able to then incorporate the watercolour and the way that that flows over the impasto paint. So what you'll find when you do that is that that seems to work quite well, but then you'll start to notice that actually it doesn't respond to the layer below. So it's flowing over the new material on this layer, but it's not interacting with any of that material on the lower layer. In fact, what it's doing is actually interacting with the canvas or paper or texture, whatever you've used, underneath. So it's as if that metallic material isn't there, and it just reacts with the whatever paper texture is. So that starts to cause some real problems. So you'd think, well, okay, we can solve that. We'll simply merge these two layers together, and then well, now my metallic's gone. So yeah, that's great. Now my watercolour will interact with all that texture. But I've now got to make the choice, is all the paint metallic or all the paint not metallic? So you're stuck. You can't have watercolour interacting with all this texture because you've been forced to use multiple layers, and watercolour doesn't react through multiple layers. So for me, that as a natural painting experience just doesn't work effectively, and it is fundamentally a blocker to be able to use those different techniques together. There is a way around that. There's a workaround that I've found, which is you can paint without any metallic being enabled. Do your whole painting. You can use all the textures, all the thickness. You can have the watercolours running down. Do that and finish your painting completely. And then what you do is you take your painting, you duplicate that layer, you insert a layer in between, and you take your duplicated layer and you make it a clipping mask, and you make that clipped layer metallic. And what you can now do is go to that intermediate layer, use any tool, any brush you want, it doesn't matter, and then you can effectively selectively bring back some metallic quality to bits of the paint that you want to be metallic. So you effectively give it a kind of metallic sheen right at the end. And because it's a clipping mask, you can obviously add and remove, so you can spend as long as you want to make exactly the bits that you want metallic, and finish the painting that way. And that way you can spend your entire painting time on one layer, but obviously you're not getting the benefit of seeing the metallic material and the watercolour and the transparency on top of it, but you can at least get the metallic at the end. So that's my workaround. It's a real shame that that kind of workaround is necessary. So the next thing we can have a look at is the new filter options, and these are dynamic filters that apply continuously rather than the filters that are applied one-off. So if you take something like a brightness and contrast filter, then you can double click on it to change the settings and adjust your image, and that will continue to then adjust in real time. So what you can then do with that is you can paint on top of that if you want, and that will work as you would expect in terms of being able to colour pick the colours underneath. But what you can also do is go back to your original layer and then paint on that. But what you'll find is that the colours underneath will look different because you're actually picking above the brightness contrast layer and then painting that colour below it, so it's then going to look different. And that for me is one of the reasons why I don't tend to use these things as a dynamic mechanism. It doesn't feel particularly natural to me. For me, if you're going to have a brightness contrast, you would just adjust it, flatten it down, and then continue to paint on it. But I'm sure for some people they'll find that helpful. There's probably a few things that you can do with that and work on it. So you can do maybe things like the hue and saturation one, and then maybe take the saturation down, and you can then work on your painting if you want to do a sort of grayscale image or something like that. It doesn't matter what colours you're applying, the image is always going to look grayscale. So maybe those sorts of use cases are helpful for yourself. But for me, as I say, it's not something that I'll tend to use very often going forward. So next up we have the refined colour panel, and what this has done is group together a number of things. So you've got the colour wheel, the sliders, the history and the colour set, and you can switch all of those on and off individually. And have any combination of things that you want to work with. That's a much more consolidated approach to the colours. I think that works really well. It's got all the options in terms of the different things around the wheels, the sliders, the history, etc. Just all nicely brought together in one panel. So I think that's a much better, cleaner, simpler UI. And that's certainly something I've been making use of. My only thought with that is, I guess, ultimately, if they're trying to unify colour, why didn't the mixing palette come into this as well? And that would really bring everything that deals with colour together in one place. So it feels a bit odd to me to have everything else there, but then still have this separate mixing palette. So maybe that could be brought in sometime in the future. I think that would be helpful. So next up we have the brush creator, and there's a lot of things that have been added to this. It has certainly added a number of elements of sophistication. Not going to go through everything today, but just call out a few highlights. So one of the first ones is this smudge on paper bumps, and along with other settings that you can do, what this allows you to do is a brush will now interact with the texture in a much more natural feeling mechanism, where it picks up on the upper layer of bumps. You can still press down and sort of push it into the texture, but it gives you a much better feeling. That works really well for some of the brushes and some of the dry media, but it does highlight a bit of an issue with the paper textures and the watercolour media, because if you take some thick impasto and then go to some watercolour, when you put that down, what you'll find is the watercolour interacts with the thick impasto as you would expect. It drains into the lower part of the texture, and you can get the ridges clearly showing as still the distinct yellow of the original pigment, and you get blue and green mixing in between. But on the paper, something really weird happens where it just it looks like it's still using the old mechanism, where it's filling in the shadows of the texture. So it looks like we've got two different things going on here, that these new brushes look like they're picking up the top texture, but it doesn't look like the watercolour is interacting. And this for me is just one of the general issues of these fundamentally two different mechanisms, where you've got the paper textures working in a completely different mechanism to the thick impasto paint. and they just don't work together very well. They struggled in 6, sometimes worked occasionally, but in 7, my experience of these two trying to work together is they just don't. And when you look at them, the more closely you look at them, the more it looks like the impasto is just this layer floating on top, which just looks really quite strange to me. But the smudge mechanism itself, that's really good. There's lots of potential with that. The other thing that I've been using that I think is absolutely fantastic is under the textures, you've got various things where you can enable dual brush, but you've also got these background textures. And what I've been able to do is to make up some brushes which basically bring through various types of thick paint, and using these two together allows me to build up really nice thick impasto textures in one go, and build up and paint on them. I can then use a combination of things, so I can use flatter brushes to interact with it, and that will be picking up the top of the surface, so it really feels like it's catching the top of the texture, which is really good without adding any more impasto to it. And then I can also go in and use the watercolour, and that will flow into that texture and work really effectively with it. So that's my current preferred mechanism. I've been building up some brushes to help support that, and that gives some really good effects. So that texture mechanism within the brush is absolutely fantastic to work with. And the other thing that I've spotted that I think is just really, really nice is a little thing, but basically when you're working with and developing these brushes, there's little controls around how it responds to pen pressure in different circumstances, and you can build all these different curves. And what's really nice is as you use the brush, you can hopefully see there's a little vertical line in that pen pressure window. So the harder I press, the more it goes to the right, which is the high, and the lighter I press, the more it is to the left. So I can get a sense of how much pressure am I putting down, and how is that curve getting adjusted in relation to that pressure. And that works on just about all the little curve editors that have pressure sensitivity on them. So that is an absolutely brilliant little addition when you're trying to modify a brush or develop a new brush, and I really appreciate that being added in. Okay, next up we have structures. I'll explain in a second why these were ultimately one of my biggest disappointments from having done the beta testing work. But first of all, what are they and how do they work? So we've got structures. You can open the library. There'll be a few default images in there. You can add your own, or you can import them. You can drag and drop to add other ones. And to add them, you just double click, and then you can click on it in the structures panel and it'll appear on your picture. You can move it around, you can rotate it, you can put it wherever you want, and then once you're ready to start painting, you can either click outside, or you can go over to the brush menu and just change the brush a couple of times and it'll come up. It's a bit clunky, not very good if you're zoomed in, all that sort of thing, but that's the way it works. And then what you'll find is that it's effectively a height map type interaction, a little bit similar to the canvas texture, but effectively you're picking up that structure, as they call it. To me, it's just another way of effectively masking some of the pixels. The difference between that and a stencil is you can actually push through that, so they're not completely masked out. But it actually works very similar, as far as I'm concerned, works very similar to the masking fluid layer for all practical purposes in terms of what I've seen it for. There are some people that are very excited by this. You know who you are. But for me, it's not something I'm going to make heavy use of. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is, it looks like it's a sort of 3D structure, but once you're actually finished painting with it and you get rid of the structure, you're just left with this flat 2D paint. There's no 3D structure there. There's no bump map, there's no text, there's no highlights, no edges. So that structure that was there to build something from isn't there now. It's just a pattern. Of course, you can use your structure and you can combine that with thick paint if you want, and that will give you a little bit more to potentially work with. In case you get something like that, where, like many times, Rebelle just crashes in the middle of doing a demonstration or a recording. Thanks for that. Okay, welcome back. Let's try that again. So what we were trying to have a look at was if we select a different pattern and then paint with a thicker brush, then again you'll see it's sort of hitting and missing based on the pattern underneath. And because you're putting down thick paint, then that will start to provide a bit more thick texture, which is obviously giving you something different to any kind of flat media, which is just ultimately going to look really flat. So when you hide that, you'll then have the pattern of that, but it still doesn't really look like it's got the structural texture that kind of 3D sort of sense that it could have done. And for me, that's why I was showing you earlier in terms of actually just baking these sorts of things into the brushes and being able to do thick text and textures and meshes and all sorts of things, actually allows you to build up texture much more effectively. So that's been my workaround in terms of trying to build up complex, interesting textural surfaces that you can then work on with the different tools like sort of flat pastels or going over it with the watercolour, and because that's proper thick impasto, it will really interact with that very effectively. So that's my kind of working mechanism that I tend to use now. The reason that I'm particularly disappointed with structures is during the beta, at one point you could have multiple structures active at any one time. That's now been reduced to you can only have one. So there's one. If you try and select another one, it basically becomes the active structure. Whereas what it was doing previously was all these things would layer up and they would come through as an actual 3D bump map. It was like an impasto structure, an actual surface with 3D depth that you could then work on. And it looked amazing. And it was so exciting that you could build the structure to begin with and then start to paint with either thin paint, watercolours, put impasto on top. It just worked really nicely. And then for some reason, it turned into this two-dimensional brass rubbing effect. That's the only way I can really describe it. It's effectively like there's something underneath. It's hard to tell. Is it actually above the paper texture? Is it underneath the paper texture? To me, it's just weird. It just, compared to being able to work with these kind of textures, build up thickness, I just don't get it. I really don't. And it's such a missed opportunity because at one point it looked fantastic. So that's kind of my big problem with these sorts of things. The other thing is really around now just the number of different ways you've got to control whether pixels are painted or not. I mean, you've got stencils, you've got selections, you've got masks, you've got clipping masks, now you've got structures, you've got masking fluid, and they all work slightly differently. They've all got subtly different interfaces. There's buttons all over the place for how you see what's masking what you're doing or how you switch it off. It's just the whole interface has become really disjointed in the general space of what is stopping you painting on a certain area. Much like what they've done with the colour thing, there's something there about unifying that whole set of elements to allow you to clearly understand if you're not painting on a pixel, why not? What is it that's stopping it? And having better control over it. My suggestion has been that I think a lot more of these things should appear in the layers menu. Stencils, structures, masks, selections. You should have all the ability to turn them on and off, to enable them separately from being able to see them, to make them active, to be able to edit them so you can move around, all these sorts of things. There could be a much better interface for all of that. At the moment it's really clunky and frustrating, which is why I don't use a lot of them now. I just focus on these new brush textures, which that to me is the bit that is working really, really well in Rebelle 7. The next one I'm going to talk about isn't so much a feature of the program, but rather the way that the software is released. Last year, there was quite a lot made about the fact that they did 23 releases, which certainly felt like an increase over the last few years, which looked like there was about 15 and 12 for those particular ones. And for me, there's a number of issues and concerns around this. I've worked in IT for way longer than I would like to admit. I'm a consultant enterprise solution architect. I work with big systems, a lot of system software releases. Doing another YouTube channel shortly, which is going to be around architecture, software, and specifically agile, and agile within big businesses. I think one of my concerns around this is the number of releases and the types of things. For me, this isn't an agile delivery. A lot of these releases are bug fixes. This is not about new features being rolled out that work. This is about a lot of defects, and we've really seen this in the launch of Rebelle 7. For me, the first 3 releases were completely unusable because of issues with nanopixel and layering and lighting issues around it. It just didn't work. 3 looked a bit better. 3 was the first time I had the program crash on me and actually kill a time-lapse recording that I was working on. It's the first time I realised that you might get your artwork back, you're not getting your time-lapse, it's gone, it's nerfed. That really dented my confidence in terms of being able to rely on the program to create content. 4 was released and then was so problematic it was pulled. And now we've got version 5. If this software was on something like Steam, you would have to classify it as early access. Some of the features aren't complete. There's lots of things that don't work. It's just not stable and reliable. Significant number of updates and releases. I've seen some notes and release notes around some of the versions, but not all of them. It's hard to see what's changing in each version. Some of them are announced, other ones just sort of appear in the background. There's no software updater, so you have to come in and download the full thing every time and then install it every time. The way it installs, if you try and install it on something other than the C drive, it puts the program where you tell it to, and then it installs a massive amount into your user folder on the C drive where you told it not to put stuff. You end up with more data in your C drive than you do in the actual program itself. So it's just not respecting where you tell it to install. It's just lots of little things like this. If you used version 6 in earnest, you've probably got a lot of stencils, textures, assets that you've imported, maybe brushes that you've made. There's no upgrade from 6 to 7, so you're left having to try and manually copy all of that across. You've got to export all your brushes, you've got to dig through things, you end up having to go into the file structure and trying to work out where all the things are and manually copy it all across. It's not a good upgrade experience. You're left to your own devices to work with the new version. So there's a lot of things there that, for me, really need to be addressed in terms of the release approach. This release that they pre-advertised and pushed very hard through lots of the social media channels that it was going to be released on the 14th of December, which felt to me like the subtitle should be Ready or Not, and it wasn't. It clearly isn't. That would be fine if this was a community project, but this is paid professional software. I think, as I said at the start, I get a copy of this because of the work that I've done in all the beta testing. But if I'd paid for it, then I would have been a little bit upset of not being able to use the thing for a good number of weeks because it was fundamentally unusable and continues to have all sorts of little niggles and problems. So for me, this is actually one of the the biggest concerns in terms of how they move this forward. This philosophy of rolling out any number of bugs and then spending months with the help of the community, thank you, to gradually work those bugs out and get the program to the point where it is actually eventually stable, by which point they're starting to push the next version of it. You could say that, well, welcome to the modern world of software, but it doesn't need to be like that. There's lots of companies that do regular releases of features that work in software that is relatively bug-free and stable. That's what agile delivery is about: regular incremental delivery of new features. So yeah, for me, this has not been a good experience in terms of transitioning into version 7, and it's a little bit similar to what happened with version 6, and just feeling like you end up not being able to use the program for quite some time. So to round things out, we'll just take another quick look at the paper surfaces. We touched on this earlier. This is about the canvases and paper surfaces having this option to be able to use paper height maps. And what that will do is, with the right brush and the right brush settings, the intention and idea is that will allow you to feel like you're catching the top of the surface, like the brush is interacting with something that is actually properly three-dimensional. It's got a bump, it's got a height, and that your brush or whatever medium you're using feels like it's catching the surface effectively. And my experience with this has been, it really depends what type of paper you're using as to how effective that is. If we try something like a canvas, then to me those first marks don't really feel like they're catching the top of the surface. Gets a bit better as you press a bit harder, but it's sort of working. If we have a look at something like the wood veneer, then pressing very lightly on that feels like it's going into the gaps, not catching the top surface. That one just feels completely wrong. It's like it's the wrong way round. So to me, it's a bit hit and miss as to the degree to which that's working. Some of it is a bit more effective than others, and I think the ones that are probably most challenging are the ones that are particularly textured. So if you try the sort of gesso type textures, so it does sort of feel like it's capturing some of it, but it does still feel a little bit like it's going into the shadows at times. And then I think the other thing is really how that interacts with the watercolour. And I think for me, when you look at that doesn't look like it's flown into the sort of the gaps and the low parts of that paper texture. It just yes, there's a kind of sense of the paper texture, but it doesn't feel like it. And when you compare that to putting down genuine impasto type thick texture, and then putting your watercolour into that, and the way that flows, that has such a genuine sense of flowing into the low parts of the texture that putting it on these photos of texture just doesn't work for me. These two different mechanisms just fundamentally don't join up in the way that they look or behave. And for me, it's why I have, as I said before, sort of really focused on the impasto. And a lot of the time now, I will literally just switch the texture off and just focus on building impasto texture, because these paper textures potentially look good for flat 2D type artwork. If that's your thing, then good. That if that works for you, that's great. But trying to get these two texture things working together, I've been trying for about a year and a half with version 6 and 7, and for me they don't look right, they don't feel intuitive, and they don't work together in a coherent way. They're just two separate mechanisms that just end up looking completely different. So yeah, this in a sense, I'm slightly disappointed that they're going down this kind of trying to fake the top points of this paper texture to be able to work out what the actual height map is. The whole program for me would be so much better if they just got rid of that and just used impasto height maps, had actual genuine height data, and had a better lighting system that could give you proper cast shadows as well as the form shadows, so that you could genuinely get thicker paint, because that's I've seen a lot of people in the forums asking for that. Okay, so it's time to put each of these features on the cool wall. Do bear in mind, this is absolutely just my impression. You might think very differently, and if you've got a different opinion, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. You let me know how you would place these features. So for me, metallic paint. I think when we look at metallic paint, it's certainly got some good aspects. It can enhance certain types of pictures. I've been doing some good stuff with some abstract things that I'll be showing you in the coming weeks. It's definitely fun to play with, but I do think it comes across better in videos than it does in the static things. I've seen a number of people talking about it being a bit gimmicky, and I can understand that kind of perspective, but for me the big one by a country mile is the layer complexity and the frustration of trying to make layers work together, use watercolour on top of it, and just get a seamless experience. That will almost put it into the not category for me, but I'm just giving it the benefit of the doubt because I think in the long term I can see that being interesting and useful, so that just saves the day for it. Next up we have the layer filters, and again for me, I can see the use case. They're non-destructive, and that allows you to do certain things. But I do have a bit of a concern just in general with a lot of the kind of features becoming in the last few years. It's what I would refer to as Photoshopification. It seems to be trying to constantly play more and more to people to try and convince them to move from Photoshop or work in that kind of space. The UI, to me, it has a number of issues. It's becoming more and more complex, and things around the layer stuff for me, it's quite limited compared to even other tools like Infinite Painter in terms of the dynamic filters it can do. Includes things like being able to do real-time outlining and these sorts of things that it can do, much more sophisticated non-destructive filters. So it doesn't really feel like Rebelle's really kind of pushing the boat out. There's it's catching up on other things. And to me, the big issue with a lot of these things is it doesn't feel natural painting under something that's kind of modifying things as you paint. There's very limited use cases for that. So that was another one, almost made it into the not category for me. But at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, it's not something I'll use much, but it's pretty harmless, and I'm sure some people will get value out of it. Colour palette, on the other hand, I think that's a really good direction. It's compact, it's intuitive, it's got almost everything there except the mixing palette. And for me, I think it's a hint in the right direction around the user interface and simplifying it, not just constantly adding more things to it. Then next up we've got the brush engine, and for me again I think there's a lot to look at and a lot to look forward to in this. It absolutely is more sophisticated. It made up for the structures because of the way that you can bring that impasto texture into it, and just that little brush pressure indicator really does help in terms of developing brushes. The only tiny downside, I have seen some of the brushes from 6 and earlier that I'd built don't seem to work quite the same way, and have to go back with those. But other than that, I think it is definitely moving in the right direction, so really glad to see that one coming in. And then we have structures, and I think, as you probably guessed from the earlier review, yeah, you can get some interesting 2D type effects. For me, they missed the big opportunity around giving you the option of having the 3D bump mapped mechanism that they had. It just feels like this weird brass rubbing. It largely duplicates a lot of what you can do with the masking fluids type layers. I'm just not convinced it adds enough, and I just don't see myself making much use of that compared to other things. Then software updates, again, you probably picked up from the comments. It's brilliant to have a team that is constantly trying to improve things, but the choice of the point of release, the number of defects and the fitness for purpose at that point is really questionable, and there's just a lot of things around the experience that is kicking out. So I hope that's something they really take on board and consider as they go forward. And then paper surfaces, I think, as we touched on it, I like what they're trying to do, the principle of it, but for me it's just back to this underlying challenge of the difference between the papers, which are that photo of a texture that's already pre-lit, and then trying to reverse back to what is the bump map that made that texture versus just having a bump map, which is what your impasto is. So I've said it a number of times, I've said it to them till I'm blue in the face. I think the software would be much more integrated and fluid if they just had one mechanism for height in the paint engine. And then a couple of things are not features, but I thought they're definitely worth having a quick mention. So in spite of all these things, Escape Motions as a team absolutely has to get the big thumbs up. Everything I've ever done in terms of speaking to them, they're really nice people, really friendly communication. They really are genuinely a dedicated team in terms of what they are trying to do, and I would hate to think anybody thought that I thought anything different. And also do a shout out to the community. You know, we work through that, look at the forums, work in terms of all the feedback through the beta tests, and then all the comments and stuff in the forum. And my experience of that and the people involved in that is really, really positive. That, you know, in spite of all the things, and I think, you know, a lot of people could reasonably be a bit upset with paying money and then getting the kind of quality they're getting, that actually a lot of the commentary and the suggestions and the feedback is really supportive. It's really enthusiastic. People are genuinely trying to help move this forward, which I think is fantastic to see, and you know, that I think is one of the strongest aspects of what's going on around this. So if you've made it this far, firstly, a huge thank you to you for watching. I hope that was interesting. I'd love to know what you think about Rebelle 7 and the features. How would you rate them? Is there things that you're particularly enthusiastic about? Are there problems or challenges? How would you like to see things move forward? I'd really like to hear. So, you know, please let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, hope that was helpful. Thank you very much again, and hope to see you soon.